Susan Powell went missing. Then her husband blew up their kids, True Crime explained. Before we dive in, kindly hit the subscribe button and let us know where you are watching from in the comment. West Valley City, Utah, December 7, 2009. It was a frigid winter morning when Susan Cox Powell, a vibrant 28-year-old mother of two, failed to show up for work. She hadn't called in, she hadn't texted, and her daycare provider was growing concerned. Her two young sons hadn't been dropped off. It wasn't like Susan to be irresponsible. She was dependable, punctual, and loved her boys more than anything in the world. Friends and co-workers immediately sensed something was wrong. The silence wasn't just unusual, it was alarming. When police arrived at the Powell home for a welfare check, no one answered the door. The house was eerily still. The blinds were drawn. But when they finally entered the home, what they found deepened the mystery. 2 box fans blowing air onto a wet carpet. No Susan, no Josh, no kids. Just a cold, quiet house with a sense of something deeply wrong lingering in the air. Hours later, Josh Powell returned with his sons, Charlie and Braden. He claimed they had gone camping overnight in the Utah desert, despite freezing temperatures and a snowstorm warning. The story didn't add up. Who takes toddlers camping at midnight on a Sunday? Police were immediately suspicious. Josh Powell wasn't acting like a grieving husband. He refused a polygraph. He lawyered up quickly, and in interview after interview, his story stayed vague and riddled with inconsistencies. Meanwhile, investigators discovered Susan's purse, wallet, and keys still inside the house. Her car remained untouched. Her phone was mysteriously missing, and in her desk drawer at work, they found a handwritten will. In it, Susan expressed fear. She was afraid Josh might hurt her. She wrote about controlling behavior, financial abuse, and emotional instability. "If I die, it may not be an accident," she had written. The writing was chilling and tragically prophetic. Those closest to Susan revealed a storm brewing behind closed doors. Josh was domineering. He kept Susan isolated. He controlled the finances, even rationing food. He refused to support her spiritually, emotionally, or financially. Friends recalled how Susan tried to make the marriage work. She went to church, took the boys to Sunday school, worked full-time while Josh dabbled in get-rich-quick schemes. But Susan was growing desperate. She had voiced concern about her children's safety. She told friends she was considering divorce. She even started documenting household inventory, taking video footage of belongings. A smart move. She knew Josh would try to strip her of everything. Then she vanished. Investigators began to dig deeper into Josh's family. What they found was unnerving. Josh's father, Steve Powell, was obsessed with Susan. He had filmed her without her knowledge, written songs about her, taken underwear from her laundry. He confessed feelings for her in his personal journals. When police raided Steve's home, they found thousands of voyeuristic photos and videos. The discovery gave the public a peek into a deeply disturbed family dynamic. Josh, raised in that environment, had inherited something dark. It became clear. Susan hadn't just married a difficult man. She had married into a twisted web of manipulation and depravity. Despite the evidence and public outcry, prosecutors were stuck. There was no body, no murder weapon, no confession. Josh moved with his children to Washington state. Susan's family begged the courts to intervene. They feared for the boys. Their fears were ignored. In a bitter custody battle, Susan's parents gained temporary custody of Charlie and Braden. Josh was granted supervised visitation. But on February 5, 2012, during one of those visits, Josh Powell committed an act so monstrous, it stunned the nation. He locked the social worker out of the house. She pounded on the door, screamed for help, and dialed 911. Inside, Josh took a hatchet to his sons, then set the house ablaze. All 3 died. The Powell case remains one of the most haunting true crime stories in American history. No charges were ever filed. Susan's body has never been found. But her story didn't end with her disappearance. It ended with 2 small coffins lowered into the ground. It ended with unanswered questions, with systemic failures, with a community shattered. And it left behind one truth: monsters don't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes they smile at you, they marry you, they raise children with you. By the time police started looking for Susan Powell, a young mother of two, her husband Josh Powell was already raising suspicions. Not because of what he was doing, but because of what he wasn't doing. He wasn't crying, he wasn't searching, and he wasn't cooperating. From the moment the search for Susan began, Josh was shifting the spotlight. But behind that odd calmness was a man whose entire life was unraveling, one cryptic statement and one disturbing action at a time. It was December 7th, 2009, the day Susan was reported missing. Josh Powell told police he had taken his two sons, 4-year-old Charlie and 2-year-old Braden, camping the night before. But there was a problem. That night, Utah had been hit with a snowstorm. Temperatures were in the teens. Roads were icy. Conditions were treacherous. And Josh, a man with no history of winter survival training, said he decided to take toddlers out camping in a remote desert canyon at midnight. Detectives didn't buy it, and they shouldn't have. That story would become the first of many cracks in Josh's carefully constructed image. Police searched the Powell home shortly after Susan's disappearance. What they found chilled them. Susan's purse was still there, her car keys, her wallet, her cell phone, all untouched. Her bed was unmade, as if she had just gotten up and left, which didn't fit her personality at all. But even more disturbing was the wet spot on the living room carpet, freshly cleaned with a fan blowing over it. When asked, Josh said he had just cleaned a spill. Investigators believed otherwise. They collected samples. The wet area tested positive for blood. Later, DNA confirmed it was Susan's blood. A friend of Susan's came forward with something terrifying. A letter Susan had written and stashed in a safety deposit box. In it, she said, "If I die, it may not be an accident. And if it looks like one, please dig deeper." She even wrote about Josh's controlling behavior, how he monitored her every move, how he took her car keys to stop her from leaving, how he'd threatened her. The will was Susan's insurance against the silence. She knew something was coming. Josh wasn't the only one acting strange. Enter Stephen Powell, Josh's father. As police began looking deeper into the Powell family, they discovered a web of disturbing behaviors. In 2011, when they searched Stephen Powell's home, what they found made seasoned detectives recoil. Thousands of voyeuristic images of women and girls. Hundreds of photos of Susan Powell, taken without her knowledge. A video diary in which Stephen confessed his obsession with Susan, stating that he believed she was in love with him. He even stole used hygiene products from her trash. Stephen was charged with 14 counts of voyeurism and child pornography. The Powell family, it seemed, had more than one dark secret. With Susan still missing, Josh lost custody of his sons in 2011 after authorities determined he was an unfit parent. The boys began living with Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, while Josh was granted supervised visitation. It seemed like things were finally moving toward justice, until one February afternoon in 2012, when everything exploded literally. On February 5, 2012, a social worker brought Charlie and Braden to Josh's rented home in Graham, Washington, for a supervised visit. But Josh had a plan. As soon as the boys stepped inside, he slammed the door shut, locking the social worker out. She immediately dialed 911. While on the phone, she banged on the door. She pleaded. She screamed. Inside, Josh was already pouring gasoline. He had doused the house, the boys, and himself. And moments later, the house exploded. Firefighters arrived too late. The home was engulfed in flames. All three, Josh, Charlie, and Braden, were dead. But the horror didn't end there. Autopsy reports showed that Josh didn't just set fire to the house. He attacked the boys first. Both children had chop wounds to the head and neck, inflicted with a hatchet. He had tried to kill them before the flames could. The gasoline was just the final act in a twisted, theatrical horror he had carefully planned. He left voicemails for his family, cleared his computer, donated the boys' toys. He knew exactly what he was doing. Josh never confessed to killing Susan, but most investigators and the public agree he was the killer. He had motive, he had opportunity, and he had everything to lose. Some believe Susan is buried in a mine shaft in Utah's western desert, not far from where Josh claimed to have gone camping. Others believe her body was destroyed more thoroughly. The location remains a mystery, but one thing is certain: Susan never left that house willingly. The Powell case shocked the nation, not just because of the murder-suicide, but because of how many warning signs had been missed. Josh had been investigated, monitored. He had even lost custody, and yet he still managed to take the lives of 2 innocent children. It was a failure of the system, and of those closest to him who refused to see what he really was. After the explosion, the story dominated headlines. Vigils were held, protests launched, laws changed. Charlie's Law and Braden's Law were proposed to ensure stricter monitoring during child visitations when a parent is under criminal investigation. The nation mourned, but it also got angry, and in that anger came a renewed push for justice, for Susan, and for every missing person whose story has faded from the spotlight. In a haunting twist, one of the boys, Charlie, had told teachers months before the murder that Mommy was in the trunk of Daddy's car. He had drawn pictures of his mother inside a car, with red marks around her. He knew, and maybe that was why Josh ended it the way he did, because the truth was about to come out, because Charlie was starting to talk, because the lies were starting to unravel. To this day, Susan Cox Powell's body has never been found. Her parents continue to search, to speak, to demand answers, and her story has become more than a true crime case. It's a warning about charm, about control, about the masks people wear, and about the cost of ignoring red flags until it's too late. For more chilling true crime stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. To understand how Josh Powell could murder his children in a blaze of fire and likely kill his wife years earlier, we must peer inside his mind. What made this man capable of such horror? What patterns in his behavior signaled the psychological decay no one wanted to see? In this chapter, we explore the twisted psychology of a man who went from awkward husband to headline-making killer. Josh Powell was not born a killer, but his childhood was marked by dysfunction. He grew up in a home where boundaries didn't exist. His father, Stephen Powell, was domineering, inappropriate, and obsessed with pornography and control. Family members described the household as emotionally toxic. Josh witnessed Stephen's unhealthy obsession with women, including Josh's own wife, Susan. Josh never developed empathy or healthy emotional coping skills. Instead, he learned manipulation, entitlement, and detachment. In his teenage years, he killed the family's pet gerbil. Then he threatened his mother with a butcher knife during an argument. These weren't just acts of teenage angst. They were early signs of a dangerous lack of empathy and escalating aggression. From the beginning of his marriage to Susan, Josh Powell sought control. He controlled the money, often refusing to provide enough for groceries. He limited Susan's access to transportation, sometimes hiding the car keys. He decided who she could be friends with and tracked her internet usage. Even when he didn't shout, his silence was a weapon. Josh kept Susan isolated and dependent. Classic abuser behavior, but control wasn't enough. Josh also wanted validation, and when Susan no longer provided it, when she started asserting herself, his resentment began to boil. On the outside, Josh wanted to look like the perfect husband. He was a member of the local LDS church, father of 2 adorable boys, and lived in a suburban home. But behind closed doors, he refused to work full-time, obsessively documented every aspect of his life in spreadsheets, and recorded hours of bizarre video diaries. These videos weren't normal. He filmed his children playing while monologuing about his innocence in Susan's disappearance. He filmed his home in case the police planted evidence. It was part paranoia, part performance, like he was creating a narrative for the world to follow. He wanted to be the protagonist of his own twisted movie. As public suspicion grew, Josh became increasingly erratic. He moved states, refused interviews, ignored his in-laws' attempts to contact the boys, When the courts ordered a psychological evaluation, the findings were damning. Josh displayed narcissistic traits. He showed little empathy for Susan or his children. He was emotionally volatile and manipulative. The evaluator recommended that he not have custody. But Josh knew the walls were closing in. He had already lost Susan. He was on the verge of losing his sons. And his father, his only supporter, was in prison. He was isolated. And isolation is dangerous for narcissists. Josh Powell believed everyone was against him. The police, the courts, Susan's family, and even his own children. He began to see his sons not as beloved kids, but as liabilities. Charlie was starting to talk. He told teachers about his mother being in the mine and in Daddy's car. He was drawing pictures that hinted at trauma. Josh knew the truth was leaking. In his warped mind, he didn't just kill to escape justice. He killed to silence it. For someone obsessed with control, suicide wasn't a surrender. It was a final act of dominance. Josh planned the explosion meticulously. He sent goodbye emails, cleared his computer, donated the boys' toys, set out the gasoline, axed his sons before the flames consumed them. He made sure that if he couldn't have his kids, no one could. And just like that, he took everything. Experts describe Josh Powell as a textbook malignant narcissist. He lacked empathy, needed control, was obsessed with image, and had a deep-seated sense of entitlement. He believed he was smarter than everyone, that he could manipulate the courts, the police, and the media. He believed he had the right to define the narrative, even if that meant burning it all down. Looking back, the signs were there: a controlling husband, a toxic upbringing, a wife who feared for her life, kids showing signs of trauma. The tragedy is that no one connected the dots fast enough. Or perhaps they did, but didn't believe what those dots meant. And that's what makes the Josh Powell case not just horrifying, but haunting. Because we saw it coming. Josh Powell's descent into violence teaches us that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like fathers, husbands, neighbors. It also highlights the failures in our systems. How courts sometimes prioritize parental rights over child safety. How emotional abuse is still often downplayed. How mental health evaluations don't always lead to urgent action. But most of all, it reminds us that silence can kill. Susan spoke out. She wrote letters. She told friends. She made a will. But it wasn't enough. And in the end, Josh Powell controlled not just the story, but the outcome. After Josh Powell's fiery murder-suicide, investigators and the public were left with a haunting question. Why did no one stop him in time? The answer lies, in part, in what he left behind. Not just the scorched remains of a home, but a digital trail of obsession, manipulation, and control. This chapter peels back the digital footprint Powell created in the years before and after Susan's disappearance. The files, videos, and journals are more than evidence. They're a window into the unraveling mind of a man who thought he could script his own truth. When police seized Josh Powell's computers during the initial investigation, they expected browser history, maybe a few incriminating emails. What they found was a full-blown digital obsession. Josh had organized every detail of his life into spreadsheets, meticulously categorized down to Susan's purchases, personal items, and habits. He logged utility bills, grocery lists, gas mileage. But some files were far darker. There were backup folders of Susan's emails, saved voicemails, photos of her private journals, even her medical records. Josh Powell had been building a dossier on his wife, not for love, but for leverage. He wanted control of her even when she wasn't around. Susan, suspicious of her husband's behavior, wrote a letter to family and church members just a year before her disappearance. In it, she described her fear. She documented the emotional abuse. She said if anything happened to her, it may not be an accident. Josh knew about that letter. He searched for it on her laptop. He deleted files, ran data wiping programs, installed encryption tools to make sure law enforcement wouldn't find what he didn't want them to see. But digital footprints aren't easily erased. And what he tried to hide ended up revealing more than he ever intended. One of the most disturbing aspects of Josh's digital trail was his library of home videos. They weren't ordinary family memories. They were monologues, scripted performances designed to frame the narrative. In one video, Josh films his sons playing in the living room. The camera lingers not on the boys, but on Josh himself. He speaks directly to the lens, defending himself. "I'm being treated unfairly," he says. "I'm a good father." In another video, he tours his home, narrating every detail. "See? Nothing out of place. Nothing suspicious." He walks through each room like a man expecting to be accused. And he was right, because those videos would become part of the evidence that showed how desperate Josh was to look innocent, even as he buried the truth. Among Josh Powell's digital files was a last will and testament. Not unusual on its own until you read the contents. He wrote it shortly after Susan's disappearance. In it, he expressed frustration with outsiders meddling in his family affairs. He made it clear he wanted full control over his sons. And then came the most chilling line: "If I die, it may not be an accident." Sound familiar? It mirrored what Susan had written a year earlier, as if the entire family had been pulled into a prophecy of doom. But where Susan's will was a warning, Josh's was a threat, couched in legal language. Police discovered Josh had frequently searched for terms like how to disappear without a trace, how to dissolve a body in acid, home explosion techniques, legal rights of surviving family. He also researched how to erase hard drives and how to create anonymous online identities. These weren't idle curiosities. They were blueprints. Josh wasn't just thinking about running. He was planning an endgame. As his custody battle intensified, Josh began emailing friends and family with a renewed urgency. But they weren't casual updates. They were farewells dressed as journal entries. In one email, he wrote, "I have been beaten by the system. My boys are all I have left. If they take them too, there's nothing else for me." Another message, sent just hours before he murdered his sons, said, "I'm sorry. Goodbye." He even emailed his attorney and pastor. Calm, direct, final. These weren't cries for help. They were announcements. Josh Powell was scripting the final act of his twisted story. When police arrived at the Powell house after the explosion, they found charred remains of computers and external hard drives. But not everything burned completely. Forensic teams were able to extract partial files from OneDrive. Among them, images of Susan, including personal photos never shared publicly. Password-protected files labeled Susan Thoughts. A spreadsheet tracking court dates, media coverage, and social worker reports. It was the mind of a man trying to control every angle of the story. Even in ashes, his obsession lingered. Some experts have referred to Josh's body of digital content as a manifesto. Not in the traditional political sense, but as a personal declaration. A desperate attempt to justify his actions, blame others. The final explosion didn't just take the lives of Josh Powell and his two innocent sons. It ignited a national outcry. What followed was not just grief, but a reckoning. People demanded answers, justice, and change. Susan Powell's case, along with the horrifying murder-suicide that followed, reshaped how America thinks about domestic violence, custody battles, and missing persons. But it also left behind one crucial question. What happens when the truth is buried, literally and legally, and the system fails everyone? This chapter isn't about the killer anymore. It's about the legacy of those he tried to erase. The moment news broke that Josh Powell had killed his two sons and himself, it was a collective gut punch to the country. How could this happen? How could a father who was the prime suspect in his wife's disappearance still have unsupervised access to his children? The flames that consumed Charlie and Braden also burned away the illusion that the system was protecting them. People watched in horror as the details came out. The hatchet, the gasoline, the planned emails. This wasn't a man in crisis. This was a man who calculated his final move. And it forced everyone, from judges to journalists, to ask, what did we miss? Public outrage turned into political pressure. The Washington Department of Social and Health Services came under fire. The custody arrangement, which had allowed Josh to have visitation at his home despite warnings from psychologists and Susan's family, was widely condemned. There were multiple signs of escalating danger, a damning psychological evaluation, Josh's refusal to cooperate with police, his increasingly erratic behavior, the children's disturbing statements about their mother. Yet none of it stopped him. This wasn't just a family tragedy. It was a system failure. In the wake of the Powell case, new legislation began surfacing across several states. Utah, Susan's home state, pushed for tighter legal frameworks in missing person investigations and custody reviews. The state created Susan's Law, aimed at giving law enforcement more access to family court records, enhancing background checks for custodial parents, allowing psychological evaluations to carry more weight in court decisions. Washington also revised its child visitation procedures, especially when one parent is under active investigation for a violent crime. Across the U.S., domestic violence advocates pushed for a broader understanding of emotional and psychological abuse as serious threats, not just background noise in custody battles. Susan Powell's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, became tireless advocates after the tragedy. They founded the Susan Cox Powell Foundation, a nonprofit that offers resources and education on domestic violence, especially the unseen forms, manipulation, coercive control, and gaslighting. Their mission was painfully clear. If someone had listened, their daughter and grandsons might still be alive. They lobbied for laws that would allow extended family members more power in custody disputes, especially when red flags are ignored by the courts. They also launched programs to help victims document abuse in ways that law enforcement would have no choice but to take seriously. Despite everything, Susan Powell's body has still never been found. Over the years, countless searches have been conducted. Abandoned mines in the Utah desert, remote forested areas, shallow graves near former Powell family homes. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Volunteers scoured wastelands, but nothing definitive ever surfaced. Josh Powell took that secret with him, and yet every few months a new tip would come in. A sighting, a map, a rumor. Susan became not just a victim, but a ghost in the American true crime consciousness. A woman everyone had seen, yet no one could find. Charlie and Braden Powell were only 7 and 5 years old when their father killed them. They were sweet, energetic boys who had started to open up about what they'd seen and heard. Teachers reported strange comments. Counselors noticed troubling behavior. Charlie had once said, "Mommy's in the mine." Braden had drawn pictures of a van and a woman lying down. Their voices were beginning to piece together the puzzle police couldn't solve. And Josh knew it. Their deaths weren't just acts of violence. They were acts of erasure. Josh wasn't just ending lives, he was silencing witnesses. The Powell case gripped America in a way few others had. It had all the elements: a beautiful missing wife, a suspicious husband, a twisted father-son dynamic, a horrific, cinematic ending. But more than that, it exposed the hidden horrors of emotional abuse. It made people realize that danger doesn't always come with bruises. It can come with spreadsheets, silence, gaslighting, isolation. Netflix, Dateline, and 2020 aired special documentaries on the case. Podcasts did deep dives. True crime forums exploded with theories and timelines. But for the Cox family, this wasn't content. It was their life, and it had been shattered. Today, the Powell family's tragedy lives on, not just in headlines, but in action. Thousands of women trapped in controlling relationships have cited Susan's story as the reason they reached out for help. Judges now approach custody cases involving domestic abuse with new caution. Police departments have begun cross-training with domestic violence specialists. And perhaps most importantly, people are finally starting to listen to the subtle signs, to the whispered fears, to the journals hidden in drawers. Because Susan Powell didn't go down quietly. And even though Josh tried to destroy her story, it only grew louder. True crime stories often end with answers. This one doesn't. Susan Powell's body is still missing. No one stood trial, and 3 lives were extinguished without justice. But her case did something else. It awakened a nation to the silent epidemic of coercive control. It forced courts to re-examine what parental rights mean when one parent may be dangerous. It proved that even without a body, a story can survive. And it reminded us that monsters don't always hide in shadows. Sometimes they live in the house next door. For more chilling true crime stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel.